from LA?
No, I grew up on the East Coast, Connecticut. I went to college here.
Where'd you go to college?
USC.
What did you study at USC?
I studied Russian.
No way.
Yeah, Russian and and then I was doing radio, just college radio, and that was the major thing for me that kind of got me into music.
So what was your intentions with studying Russian? I'm curious, the mix between Russian and radio, what kind of career would be?
I didn't really have intentions. I was taking Russian in high school, and I went to this sort of academically rigorous high school where people are kind of in this, they're basically training for leadership. So I was doing sort of history and politics and these sorts of things, and was taking Russian, just liked it, and kind of went to college with this liberal arts approach and really liked it, but then by the end of college, they were like, all right, well, if you want to keep doing this, you're going to go take the foreign service exam and maybe you'll go work for the State Department or the CIA or something. Yeah. I was like, that's not what I want to do. I want to do music stuff. So I took a job outside of music and kind of just made music and DJ'd and stuff on the side and zigzagged to where I am now.
It's pretty cool though. I mean, I'm sure the radio maybe have helped with steering you in that music path, learning how to DJ and the radio side of things. And
yeah, it's all about listening. It was all, it was that I think a lot of people who are into music have that period in their life when they're just amazed by music. I remember having this thought, there was more incredible music in the world than I could possibly ever listen to, and being so excited by that and thinking, well, I could just spend the rest of my life listening to music.
Yeah.
So that time really influenced my ability to listen, basically. And I didn't actually start really making any music until my mid-20s. Making electronic music, I think, is it's more like DJing or more like listening than other types of music because this machine is able to just autonomously produce sound. So it's really this process of listening, making a tweak, listening, making a tweak. And through that iteration, you end up with music. So it made a lot of sense for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. The progression of music creation over the years with technology has changed so rapidly that now, before, I don't know, even 20 years ago, everybody pretty much had to play some type of instrument, unless you just engineered, unless you were only engineering in a studio on a console. Now it seems like a lot of artists and people I've had on this podcast are really generative with their music and relying on the computer to just spit out ideas for them.
Yeah, I think there is a tradition. I mean, the way that I like to think of it is this kind of discussion with the machine, where the machine does something for you and then you manipulate its parameters to transform what it's doing.
Mm-hmm.
I was just listening actually to the interview you did with Dennis DeSantis.
Oh, yeah.
Where you were talking about this theme of using generation as a source of randomness, basically. And I think there's a lot to that idea, but I also think that there's an idea to the concept of generation as a sort of mechanism that you develop a relationship with, that you develop knowledge of, and then you become very good at getting what you want out of it, or at least very adept at exploring its possibilities.
Yeah.
For me, Basic Channel was music that I really loved and is influential to me sort of on the compositional side of they're listening incredibly closely to get to basically a 4-bar loop that they like. And then it's a dub mixing process where you're just listening very, very, very carefully and making small changes and recording for a while. And then you go back and edit. And so the sequencer in that sense is a generative process. The entire synthesizer, the entire kind of studio is a generative process that you understand very well.
No, that makes a lot of sense too, because in the end of the day, if you're going to learn the interface of whether it's a plugin or some kind of sequencer or whatever it is, you kind of need to learn the device regardless to be able to get the proper input and output that you want. You have to actually understand some of it, of what you're doing. And in the end of the day, you still have to make your own creative decision. Computer's not going to finish a track necessarily for you.
Yeah, for sure.
And you make a lot of really awesome devices. Maybe that's a good segue into talking about some of the things you've developed, building tools for sequencing or composition with computer music.
Yep.
And I actually found out about you through JP from Slam Academy, James Patrick. He was just on the podcast. Mm-hmm. And he showed me your all MIDI Tools, generative and transformation tool devices that you made, which was crazy. I didn't even know that with the release of Live 12, you could even create Max for Live devices inside the MIDI clip.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that was a thing. And so I've been exploring and playing with your all MIDI tools the last couple of days. Been having a lot of fun with that.
Nice.
What's your cat's name, by the way?
This is Plum.
Plum. What's up, Plum?
Yeah. She's
your inspiration.
Yeah, she wants, definitely.
She's a little camera shy.
She is, but she wants loving very much.
Do you ever just like let her walk on like your push or your keyboard to generate some new ideas for you?
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah.
She's not the best at max patching though, but she can generate some random noises that she doesn't have the kind of rigor though for programming. Unfortunately, we're working on that. She's still young.
Yeah, the attention span might be a struggle for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, we were talking about the all MIDI tools. Maybe talk a little bit about what made you want to create those and maybe who they're for.
Anybody who typically works with sequencers and wants to be able to find kind of new rhythmic and melodic ideas working in live. When I made them, in my mind, the person who uses them is probably somebody who's like an electronic music producer, like somebody who listens to Aphex Twin. But what's been funny is a lot of people that have been reaching out to me since they came out that I never would have thought would be using them, like somebody from a pretty large, basically like pop rock band that the name of which everybody knows from, like 2008. And I was like, God, I wonder what this person is doing with those tools. And I'm kind of hoping to hear all of the music that gets made with them.
That's cool.
So basically everything that I'm doing, especially these days, is really focused on sequencing. All of the music that I've made for the most part is pretty sequencer based. So I made a lot of music with Electron boxes where they're kind of the center of the compositional process. And I do all of the rhythms, melodies, all the patterns, and then even the arrangement for the most part within those machines. So I love working with sequencers. And I made an album in 2019, 2020 with that kind of workflow, and then experimenting with Max, and then became interested in kind of starting to build sequencers of my own. And the first idea that I had was toward a sort of modular sequencer, basically. So similar to how we have a modular synth that has oscillators, filters, envelopes, and so on and so forth, we could also have a modular sequencer that has clocks that produce time, clock modulators that produce sort of undulations in the speed of time, pattern generators that produce rhythms, and so on and so forth. So I made a Max package that produces basically that type of system. And through that process, discovered many different ways of accomplishing different parts of that process. So different ways of sort of deriving a clock from some other signal, ways of manipulating clocks to produce swing or things related to swing, different forms of rhythmic pattern generators. So from there, once I became aware of this new MIDI Tools feature, I remember I was on a call with, I think probably you were there, all of the certified trainers where they were telling us about Live 12. And I think I was pretty much the only Max CT in the room. And once they started talking about these MIDI tools, I'm like in the chat, like, and is it Max for Live? Can I make these?
Yeah.
Because for me, the concept of just taking these small ideas out of the Rhythm and Time Toolkit package that I made for Max and just crystallizing them into really small, simple devices that operate on the MIDI clip was really exciting to me. So it creates this, it's basically another approach to the idea of a modular sequencer, because each of these devices is very simple and very precise what it does. And you can use many of them in a kind of serial process to get to results that you like. It was really just a process of translating ideas that I had already been working with through the Max package and also through my YouTube channel, which is kind of just an outlet for me to think about these things, just a packaging of those ideas for people who use Live, which was very exciting to me because most of what I had been doing prior was really for the Max community, which is an amazing, but I was really interested in figuring out, okay, how do you kind of go through that next stage of the design process to package things really well for somebody who does not really identify as a programmer in any way, shape, or form and is really focused on getting to music quickly.
I feel like I fit that demographic for sure. Because I'm not a Max programmer. I appreciate it. I had to learn a little bit of Max just so I didn't sound dumb for my certification. But Yeah, I have a lot of respect for people who are really good Max developers, and I've had a few on this podcast. Josh Spoon mentioned your Rhythm and Time Toolkit. I think he's a big fan of that and uses that quite a bit and has shared that with the community a lot. You didn't waste any time from the time that Live 11 released to releasing these all MIDI tools, because I imagine that took a little bit of time to learn. Would you say like the design process in Max was much different than other patches or Max for Live devices you made to build it for the MIDI clip?
They are different in terms of how they work kind of under the hood. The main way in which they're different from a typical MIDI effect is that rather than operating on sort of a stream of MIDI notes or producing a stream of MIDI notes, you're working with a batch of them. So you're working with, in the case of a, say, transformer, you're working with however many are in the clip. And so you basically end up with an array. You end up with a list of notes, and then you have to do something with those in order to transform them.
Okay.
So because of that difference, where instead of receiving them serially and just getting one and doing something, you're taking them all in as one big chunk, it just changes the mechanics of the programming. But again, conceptually, the ideas track, right? So while they're built in a way that's very different from Rhythm and Time Toolkit in terms of the technologies being used and the way that the patching and the programming is done, it's really just an active translation of the same concepts to a slightly different kind of environment.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Well, maybe we can talk about a couple of the MIDI tools and how they work. You actually have a lot of really good YouTube videos explaining in detail how each one of them can be useful in different scenarios. I think like my two top favorite ones I played with so far were the micro stretch transformer. And then, which you actually had a really interesting video, because I've done like drum phasing techniques and trying to almost create like a Haas effect, as some people call it. You did a video breakdown specifically recreating Steve Reich's drum phasing effects from like back in the 60s or something or whatever, like people taking tape machines, playing this exact same track twice, but like slightly different timing. And over a longer period of time, 4 bars might be like 4.1 or something, and it continues to get longer and longer. So you get this kind of really cool offset phasing, filtered kind of sound that's detuned.
Yep.
I mean, this micro stretch transformer is a really easy way to do that. Just duplicate the track. You just turn one little knob and you get that kind of like cool phasing effect.
I think two things about that really hit it. What's exciting about these MIDI tools. So the first is this active translation that I've been talking about, going from Steve Reich's process, which started with tape, then went to a score where he was telling musicians, who are wildly talented, by the way, like telling musicians, okay, you're going to play slightly slower than the other person that is playing the same thing that you are playing. Like the fact that somebody can do that is incredible.
It's wild.
And then just translating that again into the clip, where you have not only a software environment, Ableton Live, all of these details, but also a little bit of a different way in which time is treated. Because in the case of the score that Steve Reich writes for the percussionists, he's saying you're playing at a slightly slower tempo or a slightly slower BPM or a slightly faster one. In live, we can't have two clips play at two different BPMs. There's one BPM that's global that applies to the whole live set. So the way that we compensate for that is we actually just lengthen or shorten the contents of the clip. Right. So that's the first thing that's, I think, interesting, is how does one concept map to another environment? And then the second thing is this idea that what makes these MIDI tools exciting is the ability to have a very simple musical concept or a very simple musical desire, something that you want to be able to do, and just make a device that is really, really good at doing that thing. And there are more ideas than we can make, right? I've made 14 or so now, plus or minus some random ones. There's another at least 8 coming.
Nice.
There's just so many more things. And I get messages from people all the time being like, here's a thing I'm doing manually that takes me an hour. Can you help me do that more quickly? Or one person came to me, and I haven't made this one, but they were like, as you repeat something really, really fast, we go from a rhythmic quality to this tonal quality. an oscillation at a slow speed has a rhythmic character below 20 hertz, 10 hertz. Above it, it's pitched.
Tonal, yeah.
So this person was like, oh, can you have it be so that you're re-triggering a note and you're doing it at some pitch, which is totally like an abuse of MIDI, right? And I don't know how well it will work, but it's just an example of some crazy idea that that somebody had. And so I'm really excited to see what happens as more and more people come up with ideas and then build these really simple devices that achieve those ideas. And then what we end up with is this collection of devices that can all be used together, right? They're all interchangeable. It's not like a bunch of really interesting ideas all packed into one device that can't be separated from one another. Now, as a producer, in the same way that you curate your sample library, you can curate your collection of rhythm and melody generators, which to me is so exciting. I can't wait to see what music sounds like as a result of this in 3 years.
I mean, Ableton definitely expanded the capabilities inside the MIDI clip. I wonder what it would look like if they created audio clip generative tools. Like what that could look like. You know, you could really mess with warp markers. Could you really just mash up the audio in all kinds of strange ways that haven't been done before? That would be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, a little bit like Audacity, kind of like offline audio effects, right? Like Paul Stretch for live.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of potential there. I also think there's just a lot of other things that I think Ableton could do with this MIDI clips concept that are really exciting.
Like what?
And I don't know what they're planning to do. One is like the idea of like a history of transformations. So if you've ever used Photoshop, or even if you've used like Isotope RX or something, you're performing all of these actions and you get kind of an undo history that you can see. And then you could go back to a specific place in that undo history and kind of recall that state. And you can even imagine their sort of branching paths of transformation and generation. And I think that could be a very interesting basis for kind of a method of arrangement, right? If we say, okay, here's the starting idea, and then this transformation gets applied after 4 bars, and then this other one gets applied after 4 bars. Or like we have these two and they kind of get mixed. We switch between them. Like here's the fill and here's the main thing. I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas there.
That could be cool as far as just like history of arrangement that you could use to just change the arrangement in incremental ways, is what you're saying.
Right. So instead of, I mean, the clip interface is amazing, right? Where we have a bunch of MIDI clips that have data that's kind of frozen inside of them. But in a way, you could sort of transform that to think of the arrangement being simply a series of transformative processes upon a baseline, right? So start with nothing, generate something, and generating could mean playing it in. It could mean, manually clicking and creating a clip in the piano roll. And then the arrangement occurs kind of as these sort of stages of actions upon that, rather than frozen pieces of MIDI. For me, one sort of motivating question that I don't think that I've resolved in any way, shape, or form, but one question that comes up for me all the time, and that I'm kind of always thinking about, is how do you make the arrangement process as creative and fun and sort of intuitive as the beat making or the melody creating process, right? Like I think anybody who is, this may be true for instrumentalists as well, but I know it's certainly true for producers, that it's like, it's easy to make a 4-bar beat that's sick, but how do I turn that into a track?
Yeah, I had that conversation with Ben Casey on the podcast. He said the same thing. He's like, the biggest struggle for myself and a lot of artists I see is exactly what you just said. You can make loops all day, but how do you create a full arrangement? Because you can't finish a track really unless you can finish that part of the equation. So there's a Max for Live device called Song Sketch, and there's a Song Sketch 2 that came out that I haven't played with. But it basically helps a little bit with this process, and you can create it has like templates for genres too. So you could pick a genre and then it basically copy and paste the existing clips that you have across the arrangement. But from the first version I played with, it seems that it was pretty limited as far as being able to randomize a lot of
Yeah.
things, which would be pretty awesome if you could have some kind of solid generative arrangement tool that kind of expands off of this idea. I think that would be really valuable for a lot of people.
Right. I guess there's kind of two ways to think of it. One is this idea that you have kind of a structure that's like a superstructure, and then you're fitting things into that scaffolding. And that sounds like what that is. And that's also probably what, laying things out on the arrangement view is.
Yeah.
The other approach is, which is the one that I am interested in trying to understand better and trying to find methods for, is this one that's kind of a continuation of the sort of in-time sensation of making a beat, right? So if you have a loop, you have a 2-bar loop or whatever, it's kind of constantly playing and you're just in the present moment, listening to it and modifying it. So you're not really stepping back and looking at time kind of laid out in front of you linearly. You're just inside of it, thinking about what came before and what's coming next. And so I'm curious about compositional processes that work in that fashion, where you're kind of working by having a loop that's running and then just making decisions about what comes next in a composition. And perhaps there's a relationship between the two, right? I think, like you're saying, something where you have this kind of basic structure within which things fit, but then you have opportunities for randomness or some algorithm to make decisions in a limited way might end up being the best result.
Yeah. Hey, if you have some extra time and want to make that, I'll definitely play with it.
Yeah. I mean, my approach these days has been just follow actions. So generating lots of MIDI clips using MIDI tools and doing a lot of, Command D or Option drag or whatever, duplicating of clips and performing lots of transformations and then building these follow action chains from those. And that's working pretty well. The one thing that's a little bit unusual about it, and I guess tracks back to this kind of same theme I've been talking about, is that the follow action is an attribute of the clip itself. So it's like, after this clip plays, what happens next? There's no sort of top down way to look at all of them and say, do number 1, then do number 5, then go back to 2, and so on and so forth. And so sometimes you kind of find yourself wanting that. And I know that the new package that IFTA made, or pack that IFTA made, includes some functions along those lines. And I was actually talking to Ben Casey about this, and he was saying, oh, you got to try this thing. Haven't gotten around to it yet, but it's on my list.
Interesting. Yeah, IFTA's made some cool stuff. What else has he made? I'm trying to think. I've played with some of his things.
I think it's called Performance Pack. It's like basically
that's
a macro, like a global macro on steroids.
Yeah.
And then this arranger. So I gotta get in there.
Yeah, no, his Performance Pack, the variations device in the Performance Pack, I think is a game changer.
Yeah,
for sure. You could do so much inside of like basically creating a snapshot of your entire live project and then just jumping between those different variations, and it'll snap to whatever parameter across all your tracks and devices, whatever that is, which is insane. So you can have all these snapshots of the position of everything in your project and jump between them in real time.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, a workflow that's start with MIDI tools and then make a bunch of stuff. And then when you get to the arrangement phase, using that set of tools or performance, right?
Yeah.
It's like you could then actually, in an interesting way, use the same source material that you've generated for both your performances and your tracks by just using the kind of more arrangement focused features for the tracks and the more performance focused features of IFTA's kind of body of work for your performances. Very cool.
Yeah, you mentioned follow actions, which I really haven't used follow actions that much. And I think Live 11 had scene follow actions where you could do follow actions by scene. I always thought it was interesting. And this is something that Borim Lee, who is the MD for Pretty Lights, mentioned. He said that it'd be really cool to have grouped follow actions for scenes. So in other words, you could group multiple scenes together, almost like you're grouping tracks.
Yeah.
Pretty brilliant for a lot of different cases. But like if you're performing, you could say, I always want these three scenes to be in a group. So when you launch that scene, you know all three of those tracks are together. That would be kind of interesting too.
Yeah. Again, my context is kind of Electron stuff where they have a bunch of patterns and then you can basically arrange the patterns. And so there's a lot of ideas like that of like, okay, loop this section of 3 patterns 4 times and then go to the next section.
Yeah.
So, but again, that's kind of getting out of like, that's something that's difficult to do when the follow actions are limited to something that's just an attribute of the scene itself.
Yeah.
Because it has to be aware of this thing that's kind of happening at a higher level. So it would be interesting to see if Ableton were to go in that type of direction. Of course, there's an amazing timeline built into Live. So maybe that's not necessary because you can kind of achieve the same type of thing by dragging stuff over into the timeline. But for whatever reason, I tend to like that kind of list type of interface. So
yeah, me too. Yeah, I've usually performed in session view, but I guess you could accomplish pretty much anything you want in either view if you just know how to hack it. Yeah, man. You mentioned some of these new devices that you were creating that were solving problems for people. I don't know if you're able to mention or talk about some of that or
a little bit. So there's a few. So one of them, the kind of version 1, pretty rough version 1 has already come out, and there's going to be a V2 that I'm really excited about. So this is called Phrase Shuffler, and this idea came from fellow Max CT and also Ableton CT and YouTuber Ned Rush, who has an incredible channel.
Yeah,
produces a staggering amount of content.
He was on the podcast way back in the day.
Oh yeah, I mean,
he's brilliant,
great human being. Yeah. He did this series of videos recently that were breaks A to Z. So it was like every video is another break. And he's very good at kind of preparing and chopping up breaks in Live. So he came to me with that context in mind and was like, okay, so the technique that jungle producers and drum and bass producers used was that they would slice the breaks and then they would take chunks of 3/8 notes and they would rearrange those chunks of 3/8 notes. So rather than slicing the break into 1/8 notes and then just scrambling them, they would always keep groups of 3 together. That is an incredible piece of information because the result that you get musically from 3/8 notes is just so much better. It just grooves way harder than just scrambling the single 1/8 notes. So he has this whole process where he basically quantizes the clips a little bit and then slices them to a MIDI track so that the starting point is just this, rising staircase of MIDI clips. And then we made a device together that randomizes groups of those. And by default, it'll do this group of 3/8 notes, but you can choose whatever you want.
That's cool.
And it's instant, super awesome drum and bass. Like it's pretty incredible.
Nice.
And so I have one coming that has way more features. It gives you more precision over how that rearrangement happens. The one that we made is just random. This one kind of gives you some controlled random and also some complete control options where you have entire control over exactly where those slices go. So that's one that I'm really excited about and that I've been kind of using in some of my own live stuff. And it is a great use case actually for follow actions. Because one thing I've done is basically it's like you get one loop that you really like, and then you just do a follow action that's like play this one 3 times or 4 times or whatever, and then go to one of the other ones, any of the other ones that I have here. And then when any one of those other ones are done, it is told to go back to that first one. So you have your kind of main rhythmic idea, and then you have these variations or fills on those. And that really works quite well because you're able to kind of keep a groove that makes some sense to people, and then, elaborate kind of variations on that idea.
Yeah, that's really cool. Especially if you wanted to like program that out in session view and then record that real time into your arrangement.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I feel like I would definitely do something like that if I had that.
For sure.
Hey, this episode is sponsored by Magic Mind. If you've listened to the podcast long enough, you've probably heard me talk about this magical green drink. I'm obsessed with this stuff, and everybody I've shared this drink with absolutely loves it as well. It has tons of antioxidants. It includes functional mushrooms and adaptogens and nootropics to give you all the energy and focus you need without the crash that you would get from coffee or crappy energy drinks. Just take one little shot. It'll give you all the mental clarity and focus and energy that you need. It's backed by over 240 scientific studies. I can't tell you how many times I've taken a shot and woke up and started working on music and was way more productive throughout the day. Check out the links in the show notes, get that discount. Don't take my word for it. Try it yourself. And back to today's podcast.
So that's one of them. And then there's another one that's one for working with chords, which I'm not particularly familiar with, but my collaborator knows a little bit more about those. And I've been doing a lot now where, somebody will come forward and say, hey, I have an idea, here's how it should work. And then I just do a lot of the actual programming because I've kind of built up the experience working with these tools. So that's been really fun. So that's another one that's a collaboration where it allows you to basically very quickly perform inversions of chords and manipulations of chords so that you can, start with some chord progression that you already like and then just modify that to add a little bit of variation. So that's another one that's coming.
Cool. And so then that's kind of similar to Stacks, I guess, but maybe just like a little deeper.
Yeah, Stacks is a generator. So this is a transformer. So you could
got it.
You could start with something that you generated using Stacks, and then from there transform that, and that allows you to basically have the same chord progression, but just different inversions of those same chords to kind of change up the tonality of those chord progressions. Yeah, so because I think one thing that's interesting I've noticed is with every single one of these devices, there's very often a kind of transformer version of any generator or a generator version of any transformer. Like I have a device called Phase Pattern, which is basically kind of a time modulation device. So similar in spirit a little bit to the micro stretch, where if I wanted to produce like a bouncing ball kind of sound, which you might call like a rallentando or an accelerando, where the spacing between events is slow in the beginning and then it's fast at the end. That's very, very hard to do manually. So this is a device that will allow you to do that. And it's a generator. So it's going to generate basically a bunch of notes according to that kind of pattern.
Yeah.
People now are like, well, I want to be able to apply that speeding up of time to MIDI that I already have. So now I'm like, all right, well, how do I make a transformer version of that same thing? And so that happens all the time where we're like, oh, that's cool. Now what if I made that into a transformer?
That actually makes a lot of sense because I like to program a lot of my own drums, but I kind of want to offset them just a little bit, or take notes. And rather than just using the built-in stretch or the humanize function, the pattern's really kind of cool because you can just take this almost little it's a long line, but you can make it kind of wiggle and move and shape the notes into the pattern that you want and get really creative. And then also even quantize them and lock them into the grid and just reshape the notes across the clip to the time. It's actually pretty fun to play with. I was playing with that yesterday too.
Yeah. And that really comes very much from the stuff I was doing in Max before, Rhythm and Time Toolkit and the YouTube stuff, because the way that that I think about time now in basically always in music is this idea of that line from 0 to 1, the phaser, we call it in Max, which is basically just a unit of time. So in the time that a ramp takes to go from 0 to 1, like a sawtooth wave, that's a bar or a beat or whatever. And if I were to then slice that up, I could get 16th notes or 8th notes or quarter notes or whatever. But if that line is not straight, if it wiggles, if it's exponential or logarithmic, then I basically am changing the speed of time over the course of that bar or beat or whatever. And so that's like something that I've made dozens of videos about at this point. It's just different versions of that concept. So that is really like a copy paste of that kind of idea into live.
Yeah. No, you've made some really cool tools. I'm excited to explore the rest of them.
One that you might be interested in based on what you just said, if rather than relying kind of on the stock humanize, is there's one called Feel, which is in the most basic sense just swing. but there's kind of an advanced mode where you can basically, whatever the grid is for the clip, the way to think of it is you're kind of just shifting those grid lines left or right. So it gives you like a bank of sliders, and each of the sliders will just shift the grid line left or right. And you're kind of, you're creating a feel of time underneath your pattern.
Oh, that's wild. Yeah, I'm actually playing with it right now. And there's like an advanced mode too, where you can physically take each individual note and push it or pull it forward or backward.
Yeah. So the advanced mode, it is moving the notes, but the way to think about it is that it's moving the grid lines, because the number of sliders is equal to the number of grid lines in the clip.
Wow.
And the reason I think that that's a little bit more useful than having the sliders link directly to the notes is if you have a chord, right? If you have 3 notes that have the same start time, or even that occur within the same grid frame, they all get shifted the same amount. So it's this idea of the way we're achieving that result is to shift the notes, but the thing we're actually doing is modulating the speed of time over the course of the clip.
Yeah.
And that's, again, I was talking about microstretch earlier about this idea of like, we're not telling the clip to play at a slower BPM. We're just making it a little longer, right?
Yeah.
It's the same kind of idea. And so that's another thing where, if I were at Ableton and I were in charge, I would have perhaps devices that do a few other things besides generation and transformation. One of them would be this idea of actually warping the clip grid underneath the notes, and then the notes stay in the same position they are relative to the grid lines, but you just warp the grid. The other one that I think is exciting is the idea of algorithmic selection of notes. So I have a few devices that kind of have 2 stages, where the first stage, its point is basically to pick which notes are then going to be transformed. Because like if I'm going to transpose or if I'm going to divide notes, I might not want to do that to all of them.
Yeah.
In fact, I could make a melody by saying, just start with like a straight pulse on C3 or whatever, and then just transpose every third note by 5 steps. And now you have this simple melody. There's a device that's basically, it's called pattern transform, that basically says, first apply this pattern to decide which notes will be transformed. And that itself, that concept of the selection preceding the transformation, could be its own whole class of devices. And again, it gets at this idea of modularity, where once I have a class of selection devices that are very flexible and very powerful, then I can then apply whatever selection logic I want, and then apply whatever transformation logic I want, and get so many possibilities from that.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, there's endless possibilities with what you said. I feel like my brain starts to break when I go any deeper than that. I have to like really think through what I'm doing.
Especially with no visual aid, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It would just be interesting to see. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if there will ever be any kind of generative audio clip options someday. Because I work with audio primarily. I love working with audio a lot. MIDI's awesome, but even then, a lot of times I'll freeze flatten or resample.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun to think about, man. There's a lot of different devices that you've made, and I'm looking forward to seeing more. Are there any other algorithmic or generative music creation devices that you've found recently or in the past that like are just your go-tos, or you love, or you think people should know about?
I'm mostly using Live right now, and Max. I draw a lot of inspiration from Eurorec. So I don't have a modular synth, but I just draw ideas from what I see in that world.
That's actually really surprising, because I feel like the Rhythm and Time toolkit that you made is primarily, I think, mostly for people who are modular, right? Like a lot of times they'd use that.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, certainly I think it would be I actually know a few people who are kind of using that to sequence their modular. I just don't, frankly, have enough time or money to kind of go down that hole.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe one day I'll get to have I mean, I would certainly, if I had $4,000 around or whatever, I'd get one of those beautiful make noise 2-level systems.
Yeah.
I'm quite interested, I think, on that side in the systems that are kind of the product of some person's ideas. So I think Make Noise is a great example. Like Tony Rolando, I just think is just so inspiring as a person who is super creative and also has the technical ability to produce the product. And there's so much music now that just wouldn't exist if it were not for those devices. Like the qualities of those music, you can really hear the ideas of the designer in that music. And Buchla is another great example of that. And there's so many others. So if I were to go in the modular direction, I would probably go that route. But then in my day-to-day life, I'm always drawing on small ideas that I can borrow from that world.
Yeah. A lot of people I know who have like the nicest, fanciest modular racks don't release much music at all.
Which, I think is fine. Some people have a train, like a model train set. There's actually in LA, I really want to go. There's like some old retired people that have an incredible, elaborate city of like, I think it's like 1930s LA with trains and stuff in their basement. I think there's more pressure on music makers to finish stuff and release stuff than there should be. Now, certainly it's wonderful to do that. But also, I think having a modular synth and just nerding out really deeply on how it works and what it could do is just a really great way to spend the hours of 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. a few nights a week.
Yeah, definitely. It's its own form of music therapy, I think, where you can just sit and create and nerd out and create the most wild sounds that have never been made before, and just be able to. It's its own art form in itself. I don't think there needs to be pressure to necessarily release or have a final outcome with that. But
yeah, and Max too. I do Max workshops for beginners, and people are like, "Why would I program an EQ when I have an EQ?"
Yeah.
I'm like, you're right. Unless you want to go that route, like unless your goal is to kind of get, become an engineer,
right?
Then you shouldn't make an EQ, like at least a conventional EQ. If your goal is to make as much music as possible really quickly using techniques that are readily available to you, then you should do that. Mm-hmm. But if you're like a person who did Legos as a kid, or you just like to tinker and you like to think and explore ideas, then Max is incredible for that. And certainly I think, there are people that make amazing music with Max, but it is the product of a kind of deep relationship to a tool set that is pretty idiosyncratic. There's an amazing book by Mark Fell, who is an artist that I really admire, called Structure and Synthesis, I think. And a lot of the book is really about tools and kind of the artist's relationship to tools. I'd say maybe the biggest thing that I took away from it is just the simple power of becoming very deeply related to your tools, whatever they happen to be. And Max could be one of those, modular could be one of those, live could be one.
Yeah. There's a whole world in Max and Max for Live that people could explore. I mean, in the little knowledge I have, like, it's pretty fun because it's endless and you can do so much inside of it. You've also done a decent amount with like audio visuals.
Yeah, I spent a bunch of time in 2020. I had made that album that I mentioned, and then my goal was to play shows, and then no shows happened in 2020. So I watched Federico Fotoraro's videos on YouTube. He has a channel called Amazing Max Stuff, where he talks all about the visual side of Max. So, working with 3D and 2D visuals. So I made an album. I basically made a bunch of music videos, basically, for my own music, and then kind of released those as a thing. So that was tons of fun, great opportunity to learn. I was very much a beginner in that when I started, and came out like a low intermediate user of that stuff. Not something I'm doing all that much of these days, but I'm excited for the opportunity to dive back into it.
Yeah. Was there any like specific tools in that process that you found really interesting for like generative visuals?
Two things. So the first was, well, kind of sampling, I guess, as a basic starting point, and sampling either in 2D or in 3D. So 2D sampling is basically just images. And then I was writing really simple algorithms that basically try to manipulate and combine images. So I have one video that's basically just like 300 videos that are kind of like morphing into each other using really not very complex algorithms that I wrote that just find creative ways to kind of blend two images together. And then in the 3D space, scanning objects. So the iPhone, because it has the Face ID camera, which is actually like a depth camera that sees you in 3 dimensions, is able to produce a 3D model. So I found some app that would let me scan objects and then import those into Max and then just manipulate those 3-dimensional objects in Max and
cool.
kind of just like screen record the results. What was funny about that album was I didn't really have any knowledge of how to use editing software. There was no, like, I didn't use Premiere, I didn't use DaVinci Resolve. I just like figured out how to arrange them in Max and recorded them, which was a pretty painful process, but was kind of interesting in and of itself. And I certainly had the time to figure that stuff out in 2020.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I did like a 3D model of my Squishmallow in 2020 because I was really bored. If you know what those are.
No,
like,
what is that?
It's like a little pillow, but they're like all characters. He's a sloth. It's like a really comfortable soft pillow, and I made like a 3D model of him. And I did the same thing, not in Max, but there's some like cool apps out there for like 3D modeling.
So many.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, I want to respect your time. I know it's almost been an hour. I feel like we could probably keep talking for a while. I know you've got an appointment you got to run to as well.
That one isn't for another hour though, because I had 2 hours on the calendar here. So.
Oh yeah, time changes is weird sometimes. But I was going to ask, like, what do you think the future looks like for algorithmic music or generative music, inside or outside of Ableton Live? Like, what do you think the future looks like with that?
I think it's really interesting because on the one hand, we have AI, which is this elephant in the room that we haven't even talked about yet in this conversation.
Yeah.
Right. But so much of the discussion about AI is about being able to basically get from text into music. Right. And like pretty much complete music. But I think as we're seeing in the rest of life, in our relationship to AI, we're kind of like grasping that AI is just a really powerful tool for most of us. If you're making music, or actually a better example is like if you're writing kind of boilerplate text, like some marketing copy or something, you might need to be worried that AI could just completely do all of that for you. But if you're somebody who's doing something more creative, then we don't want AI to just do all of it, right? But AI becomes this incredibly powerful tool. I think certainly there's a lot of space for AI to kind of inhabit this space, this tool space. And the question really comes down to the product design. How does that technology get packaged into devices or products or tools that people want to use? And what is it like to use them? And so in that sense, it's really not particularly different from what I'm doing, or even what people were doing 40 years ago, making, electronic music instruments. It's just a question of taking a technology that's very interesting and making it available to people. So, because we talk about this idea of generative, but I think that what generative is basically a moving target. It's just a goalpost that keeps going outward away from us. People probably thought, a sequencer like what Tangerine Dream or Kraftwerk were using in the early days of sequencers were generative. Now we just don't think about step sequencers as being generative at all. And we think now of, some algorithm that has 3 knobs that produces a rhythm as being generative, or something that uses noise or randomness as being generative. So to me, it's a question of, what new technologies become available and kind of become packaged for people's use. How do those technologies try to solve problems? And then ultimately, how do the artists pick them up? To me, what I would like to see happen basically is that people just seize the possibilities with gusto. People become interested in embracing tools that will produce results that perhaps they don't entirely understand and that they can't really predict what it's going to do, and end up making some really weird music. right? I mean, there's the classic example that comes to mind for me is the TB303 producing Acid House, because DJPR just used it in a way that like it was not intended to be used.
Mm-hmm.
Or the music that was being made by Suzanne Ciani and other people using Abukla. So now we're in a new phase of that. The possibilities are as wide as artists allow them to be. And that is, I think, another reason why AI is exciting, because AI, to some extent, closes off the field of stuff we kind of already know about so well that we can describe with language, right? If we can describe it with language and it's a form that's already so well produced that AI can just do it, then you have no choice but to go in some stranger direction. And then that's where algorithmic tools or kind of just newer tools start to become really valuable to people. So I'm really excited to see what people make. And I'm really excited to just keep making weird tools for people.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. People have like built models based off of what already exists. And so like a lot of the AI music I hear sounds very AI right now because it's based off of existing content that people have made, right?
Right.
And they're training it off of nothing really new. But I think as it gets better and better, it's going to start creating new ideas, and it's going to be much harder for people to have writer's block because they'll be given all these tools and different like ideas by AI that are
Yep.
based off of stuff, but then you could maybe use those tools in ways that hasn't been used before.
Right.
Like dance diffusion, I think, is like a small example. If you've ever played with that, it's like you basically can feed it like small loops or one-shot samples and say, give me something similar to this, and it'll spit out an endless amount of new ideas based off of whatever you give it.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so many small problems that I think that technology can solve. One that I think is really interesting is controller mapping. So if you have an MPE controller like Push 3 or Roly Seaboard or whatever that thing is called, you run into this problem pretty quickly, which is like, what do I map all of these squishy dimensions to? Right? I have like 5 axes of control per finger, and now I have to figure out like, all right, one's going to go to the filter cutoff, one's going to go to the resonant, and it's a lot of work to basically produce those mappings in ways that are interesting. And so as a result, what a lot of people end up doing is just using the preset, like Seaboard or Roly or whatever. They have a VST that is designed to work with their thing and produces very interesting results. And that's great. I mean, there's probably some really cool sounds to be made there. But I think if anybody wants to kind of produce their own mappings, basically that allow them to play whatever instrument they want to in this very expressive way, we need to figure out how to solve for the problem of how do we map that pretty rich, complex stream of data to the parameters of whatever device they're controlling. And it's time consuming and boring to do that manually, and artists just aren't going to do it.
Yeah.
That's an area where AI can be very useful. I'm working on a project for an artist right now who has just a physical object that has some sensors, and it can sort of sense, how it's moving. And then they have in Live just an instrument rack with a bunch of macros, and they've said, okay, these are the 8 parameters of this system that I want to be able to control. And so the question is, how do we map the motion of this object in several dimensions? So it's like X, Y, Z, and then the speed of its rotation and all of these things. How do we map those to 8 parameters? And what ends up being the most interesting is not just one-to-one mappings, where it's like, oh, the X position goes to the filter cutoff, the Y position goes to the resonance. It's this complex multidimensional mapping between the two, which is why acoustic instruments are so great. If I strike a drum more hard, or I strike it in a different place, not only does the loudness of it change, or the envelope change, or the timbre change, but they all change at this, in a very complex, nonlinear way. But to produce such a mapping manually would just not happen. And so that's where AI can be very interesting. So for this project I'm working on, I'm using a package called Flucoma that was produced by, I think, mainly some researchers at the University of Huddersfield. And one of them, James Bradbury, I know pretty well, works at Ableton now. And they have some incredible tools for solving these kinds of problems. So you can basically train this pretty simple neural network on the motion of this object and the parameters of this instrument rack or synth or whatever, and generate this mapping for you. And it's very similar to the process of making music. You're kind of just tweaking, listening. Okay, does that do what I want it to do? No, not really. And it's incredible. And it really makes the question of performing with these rich, sensitive devices very powerful. And so now the question is someone who's going to come along and make that product, right?
Yeah.
And there could even be a dimension there where not only is there AI being used on the level of actually producing the mapping itself, but AI is also being used to train the AI that does the mapping. Because it's still a bit of a cumbersome process to train this thing. Okay, when I go like this, then make this sound, right?
Yeah.
But I think, if you have a large data set of mappings, then you could actually really streamline that process for artists of being able to make use of those types of controllers. So that, I think, is an example of a very specific problem that actually enhances human creativity using AI rather than curtailing it or displacing it.
Yeah, I think isn't that called like supervised learning when you have AIs training AI, which is like also causing a lot of problems right now for like Google and other people where they have like hallucinating stuff. It's like, but the concept is awesome. And I totally hear what you're saying. Like, it's really exciting to think about like using AI as a shortcut to train these like hyper complex models and things like that, like having this sphere that you can interact with. And it's like very dynamic and mapped in all these different non-traditional ways that you can create something that doesn't exist.
Yeah. And I'm not an expert in that field at all. But you already see this happen where if you use ChatGPT and you give it a prompt, and sometimes with some of them, you'll see it will like type out a paragraph that's like the user is looking to do XYZ. And it's a very long paragraph, particularly if you're using the image generators. You'd be like, oh, make me a monkey that's eating a banana on top of the moon with like on a skateboard. Yeah. And it will like write way more describing for the model what it should do. And that's basically the AI, like the AI sitting in the middle and saying, okay, I'm going to have an AI that is a prompt engineer, and then I will have the prompt be fed into the image generating AI. So in a sense, it's the same concept where we're basically using AI to generate the inputs that we feed into another one. Yeah. But that's I hope that, I hope that somebody in the comments of this video who's an expert on this stuff is not like, that was completely wrong. But that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah. I'm not an AI expert at all, but yeah, I've been thinking about like, how could it be used other than just like make me a sample pack based off of this or, blah, blah, blah. It's like, how could AI be built into devices or existing plugins to take it even further than what's possible today? I was thinking about this actually as I was working on Resampler Pro with Toby Hunka. I don't know if you know him, Ableton drummer, but he built a device that basically automates the process of creating sample packs in Ableton Live.
That's cool.
I could send it to you if you want to play with it. But
yes.
I was thinking it was like, well, part of the issue we ran into is like with the API, we couldn't necessarily easily, and it's possible, I just think we'd have to play with it, but being able to create like multi-velocity sample packs, we had to do some more stuff. So, but what if AI took, say, like a snare drum sample that's like just obviously recorded at one velocity, and then could actually recreate, like you were talking about the timbre of like, if that drum was actually hit in real life from 0 to 127, like what would that actually sound like? And like, that's one small use case where I would love to see AI implemented, like something like that.
My friend Cyrus Vahidi is an expert in that field of like audio analysis. So basically they're like statistically describing sound, and then they're able to resynthesize like that.
Cool. It's awesome.
Yeah. So yeah, I would love to see tools like that. Yeah. And then on the MIDI side, like I'm working on a device that may happen, may not. It depends on if it actually works, which is using very simple statistical models to basically try to produce MIDI clips that are similar to ones you already have. So this idea of, I want a variation on this idea that I already like because I want to add a little spice, a little bit of variety into the music that I'm making. So if we can describe statistically, basically how that melody and rhythm is constructed, then we could reproduce new variations that are similar but different, and even have a knob that's like the amount of difference that gets applied. So, my technical skills in that domain are pretty limited. So I'm working with pretty primitive stuff like Markov chains, but the results are pretty interesting. And certainly they, I've been in the experiments that I've been doing, they produce interesting musical results. So I think with somebody with more chops in that domain, there's really a lot that you could do.
Yeah, I can only imagine what that will be. Yeah, man. Well, Philip, thanks for being on the podcast. This has been really fun, and I was excited to meet you, and I like the tools that you're creating, and I look forward to seeing more. I'm sure I speak on behalf of a lot of other people when I say that. I think you're super talented, really smart. Yeah, man. Thanks again for joining the podcast. Any upcoming projects that you didn't get to mention that you wanted to shout out before we go?
No, I mean, the main thing is the next pack of tools. Those are going to come out hopefully in the fall. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd also love to do like a discount code for the tools I already have for this podcast, if you're down.
Absolutely. I'll shout that out in the podcast, and I'll make sure I include that in the show notes if you want to shoot me like a discount code or something.
Great.
Or however you want to do that. I'd be happy to do that.
A discount code that is attached to the bundle, the all tools bundle, and it'll be like 20% off that.
But yeah, man, for sure. Everybody check the links in the show notes. Make sure you give Philip a follow. Where's the best place for people to connect with you?
Instagram is good. I also have a Discord server where we have Max nerds, Ableton nerds. So that's a place where I can be found. And yeah, we'll leave a invitation link for that as well down below.
Sweet. Yeah, everybody go check that out. Good having you on the podcast, man, and look forward to seeing new stuff, and let's definitely connect soon.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. Do me a huge favor if you would and hit that follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening to the podcast. If you don't hate the podcast, please leave a 5-star review. It would help me out a ton. Don't forget to check back on Tuesdays for new episodes. If you want to be the first to get new episodes and stay updated and get free new devices and sample packs and other stuff that I'll be sending out in the future, join the newsletter. Just go to liveproducersonline.com/newsletter and or check out the links in the show notes. Make sure to give this guest a follow on the socials. Give them some love for spending their time. And once again, thanks for listening to the podcast. I will see you next time. Later.